The great military events of the year 1863 have pushed out of men's memories the less dramatic but scarcely less important civil events. To begin with, in this year two of the greatest personalities in the South passed from the political stage. In the summer, Yancey died, and in the autumn, Rhett went into retirement. The ever malicious Pollard insists that Yancey's death was due ultimately to a personal encounter with a senator from Georgia on the floor of the Senate. The curious may find the discreditable story embalmed in the secret journals of the Senate, where are the various motions designed to keep the incident from the knowledge of the world. Whether it really caused Yancey's death is another question. However, the moment of his passing has dramatic significance. Just as the battle over conscription was fully begun, when the fear that the Confederate government had arrayed itself against the rights of the states had definitely taken shape, when this dread had been reinforced by the alarm over the suspension of habeas corpus, the great pioneer of the secession movement went to his grave, despairing of the country he had failed to lead. His death occurred in the same month as the Battle of Gettysburg, at the very time when the Confederate and the Confederacy was dividing against itself. The withdrawal of Rhett from active life was an incident of the congressional elections. He had consented to stand for Congress in the 3rd District of South Carolina, but was defeated. The full explanation of the vote is still to be made plain. It seems clear, however, that South Carolina at this time knew its own mind quite positively. 5 of the 6 representatives returned to the 2nd Congress, including Rhett's opponent, Lewis M. Eyre, had sat in the 1st Congress. The subsequent history of the South Carolina delegation and of the state government shows that by 1863, South Carolina had become, broadly speaking, on almost all issues, an anti-Davis state. And yet the largest personality and probably the ablest mind in the state was rejected as a candidate for Congress. No character in American history is a finer challenge to the biographer than this powerful figure of Rhett, who in 1861, at the supreme crisis of his life, seemed the master of his world, and yet, in ever lesser crisis, was a comparative failure. As in Yancey, so in Rhett, there was something that fitted him to one great moment, but did not fit him to others. There can be little doubt that his defeat at the polls of his own district deeply mortified him. He withdrew from politics, and though he doubtlessly thought the editorship of one of his sons inspired the continued opposition of the Mercury to the government, Rhett himself hardly reappears in Confederate history, except for a single occasion during the debate a year later upon the burning question of arming the slaves. The year was marked by very bitter attacks upon President Davis on the part of the opposition press. The Mercury revived the issue of the conduct of the war, which had for some time been overshadowed by other issues. In the spring, to be sure, things had begun to look brighter, and Chancellorsville had raised Lee's reputation to its zenith. The disasters of the summer, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, were for a time minimized by the government and do not appear to have caused the alarm which their strategic importance might well have created. But when in the latter days of July the facts became generally known, the Mercury arraigned the President's conduct of the war as a vast complication of incompetence and folly. It condemned the whole scheme of the Northern invasion and maintained that Lee should have stood on the defensive while 20 or 30,000 men were sent to the relief of Vicksburg. These two ideas it bitterly reinstated, and in August went so far as to quote a famous passage on Parliament's dread of a decisive victory over Charles, and to apply it to Davis in unrestrained language that reminds one of Pollard. Equally unrestrained were the attacks upon other items of the policy of the Confederate government. The impressment law began to be a target. Farmers who were compelled to accept the prices fixed by the impressment commissioners cried out that they were being ruined. Men of the stamp of Toombs came to their assistance with rallying accusations such as this: "I have heard it said that we should not sacrifice liberty to independence, but I tell you, my countrymen, that the two are inseparable. If we lose our liberty, we shall lose our independence. I would rather see the whole country the cemetery of freedom than the habitation of slaves." Protests which poured in upon the government insisted that the power to impress supplies did not carry with it the power to fix prices. Worthy men, ridden by the traditional ideas of political science and unable to modify these in light of the present emergency, wailed out about this at Richmond. The tax in kind was denounced in the same vein. The licensing provisions of this law and its income tax did not satisfy the popular imagination. These provisions concerned the classes that could borrow. The classes that could not borrow, that had no resources but their crops, felt that they were being driven to the wall. The bitter saying went around that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. As land and slaves were not directly taxed, the popular discontent appeared to have ground for its anger. Furthermore, it must never be forgotten that this was the first general tax that the poor people of the South were ever conscious of paying. To people who knew the tax gatherer as little more than a mythical being, he has suddenly appeared as a creature who swept off relentlessly the tenth of their produce. It is not strange that an intemperate reaction against the planters and their leadership followed. The illusion spread that they were not doing their share of the fighting, and as rich men were permitted to hire substitutes to represent them in the army, this really baseless report was easily propped up in the public mind with what appeared to be reason. In North Carolina, where the present farmer was a large political factor than in any other state, this feeling against the Confederate government because of the tax in kind was most dangerous. In the course of the summer, while the military fortunes of the Confederacy were toppling at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the North Carolina farmers, in a panic of self-preservation, held numerous meetings of protest and denunciation. They expressed their thoughtless terror in resolutions asserting that the action of Congress in secret session without consulting with their constituents at home, taking from the hand laborers of the Confederacy 1/10 of the people's living, instead of taking back their own currency and tax, is unjust, tyrannical. Other resolutions called the tax unconstitutional, anti-republican, and oppressive, and still others pledged the farmers to resist to the bitter end any such monarchical tax.